Abdurrahman Tour was out of the country, the Vice Chairman, Hassan Isujama, was sleeping under the stars outside the port warehouse in Berbera. That was what Somaliland had as governance infrastructure at the time. And though there was some progress that first year, in 1992, a lot of it was reversed by fighting between factions of the SNM and between clans, however you wanted to describe it at the time. I identified clans at the time on the BBC and was hit for it, because though clans somehow didn't exist in Somaliland, I'm glad that we've come a long way and we can now talk about these things. And again in 1994 to 1996, I remember sleeping at a friend's house in downtown Hargeisa and waking up to the sound of artillery shells moving in both directions across the capital city, and visiting the displaced people in places like Bandar Wanag and across the border in Gashamo, places like Salahle, because Somaliland was once again at war with itself. So it hasn't been that easy. It's been, and I say this to underscore the hard work, the effort that has been required to take Somaliland from a place where violence was almost a daily occurrence, where as part of a medical team, we were treating 1.5 or 6 victims of landmines every single day, just within Hargeisa city limits, amputating limbs, to where it is today. It's been a long, hard road. And there is still, as we've just heard, there is still conflict and instability in parts of Somaliland's territory. The east is far from settled. There are still security challenges throughout the country. I think 2 weeks ago, I was there on a visit to look at the rule of law and order, and we were told by the police or the Attorney General there are no less than 15 cases related to Al-Shabaab working their way through the judicial system. There is indeed a serious internal security threat as well. So where did the stability and the security come from? And what are the challenges ahead? Well, in the interest of time, I'm not going to relate another history lesson for those of you who probably know the history of Somaliland much better than I do. Part of it was a matter of fortune, that the SNM, when it came to power in Somaliland, had already existed for a decade. And so it had been through alternating leadership cycles, had its own internal coup, had overcome its own internal coup, had worked out ways of governing that meant that when in 1991 it found itself in control of a large part of Somaliland's territory, there was not a political vacuum. In southern Somalia, things didn't work out that way. The oldest movement, the SSDF, had been in some turmoil since the mid-1980s, and the movements that took over Mogadishu were less than 2 years old. So they didn't have that experience of a democratic alternation of power within themselves, and I think that's one of the reasons that we saw the catastrophic results that we did in the early 1990s. But then the next step, Somaliland moving so quickly from a militarized faction, the SNM, to a civilian government in 1993. Yes, it included elements of the SNM, but yet it was also a civilian government underpinned by a social compact. And I think this is where Somaliland's real strength comes from. The forging of a hybrid system of governance that has the characteristics of a multi-party constitutional democracy, and yet fundamentally is anchored in the social tradition of Head, customary law. The charter, the first charter of Somaliland, received legitimacy from leadership of all of the major clans, communities of Somaliland. And that legitimacy has served Somaliland very well over the past quarter century. It continues to express itself in the political system. The Gursi itself remaining an expression of the face of kingship in Somaliland's representative institutions. And this has been underpinned, this success has been underpinned by, first, a tradition of dialogue. I see in different books, different researchers, scholars, I can never be sure anymore who's telling the truth, but there were 18 peace conferences, there were 39 peace conferences just in Sanag alone. I mean, I don't know. There were dozens. There have been hundreds.